Okay, working on hookworms, part 3. We finished up with hookworms in 9,000-year-old stool sites, and if they found one from 10,000 and 20,000 and 50,000 years ago, they would always find parasites. Every native person that lives in a native human environment has some parasitic burden. If they have the right balance and the right healthy mix, and that's a different question. But there always is some worm population in their intestine controlling the inflammation. All right, so let's talk about our Viking genes. Are they responsible for our autoimmunity? And let me tell you what I mean by Viking genes here. So this is my world map. There's a better one coming, don't worry. But this is my world map. So basically you have these peoples, which are the kind of ancestors of all the European white peoples that populated the world. So they came down through Germany. They founded a bunch of tribes there in Central Europe. Then they moved west. They wiped everyone out. In fact, as early as late as 1600, the Saxons came through and wiped out all the native genes in here, in England also, and Ireland. So basically we're all from these people, the Germanic tribes, who are all from the Norse, aka the Viking tribes. So that'll come into play with our autoimmunity. And then of course those populations emigrated to America and were sent to Australia. And that is where you find the highest rates of autoimmune disease. You can just look at this map here. So these peoples kind of seeded the autoimmune population. And not to, bury the main point here, is what happened is these people were highly parasitic. If they look at the ancient Viking stool sites, they had not only their worms, but they had the worms of their sheep and goats and pigs. And the people had a very high parasitic population. And they evolved and they adapted to that community. And then in our century, in the last 100 years, we've eliminated that population of parasites that control the inflammation. So now what you see is the most likely inflammatory patients are the ones that have this Viking heritage that have been cleared of their worms. And that theme will carry through this Viking section. We're all Germans, and we have been for 1,600 years. Oh, not 1600 AD, 1,600 years. The Anglo-Saxons invaded Britain and wiped out virtually all the native genes. So that's the gene pool we have. Highly aggressive immune system of Vikings. Despite their high parasitic populations, they were extremely strong and aggressive. Certainly weren't affected by their worm burden in the way that we've been taught to think about worms in modern medicine. So this is the story here. So basically, the Viking populations were highly populated by worms, and that was an uphill battle for their immune system. So just like a car going uphill, there was no need for brakes because you could only get going so fast. And that's not to mention the other part of parasites is that they control inflammation. But just the burden of it itself was an uphill battle. Now, since we have cleared the human species of these natural population, now it's a downhill race and it's going out of control. This car without brakes that evolved to not have brakes because it did not need them. Just like we don't make vitamin C because we evolved not to need it. Good morning, Quinn. The same reason we didn't evolve this control on our immune system because it was always an uphill struggle. Now, modern society, these people race out of control with highly inflammatory diseases. Me and my family being one of those peoples. And this is a nice repetitive slide here. Okay. Anyway. Vikings had worms. They're looking back to, 1018 and 1030, and they're looking at the stool sites, and you could just read through. There were tons of different worms. It's important when we're correcting disease, right, connecting autoimmunity, that we make sure the normal structure is restored. To restore function, like if someone broke their knee and it healed improperly, they would always have knee and hip problems until the bone was straightened out. Well, the same thing with our inflammatory system. To correct the function, you have to correct the structure. And the proper structure of human intestinal systems is our immune system, the mucus that's there, the bacteria, and the proper worm population. Again, so here's this is a cancer slide, which really doesn't belong here, but it just talks about, you can see the highest rate of cancer is in kind of Norse people, Vikings, Germans, that have spread out but been cleared of their worms. And that's because they become hyper-inflammatory. And here's an autoimmune slide. Vikings are to blame why Scottish people have the highest levels of multiple sclerosis in the world. So what you could do to these people is give them worms, and you would see a great improvement in those conditions. And then it just talks here, a little slide about the genes that create autoimmune disease. But why would we have genes that create autoimmune disease? There's no reason that type of gene would be beneficial for our survival, unless you add the worm part of the equation back in, and then you see what it would fill different pieces in the equation that would make it work out to be not detrimental to our health. They were much taller than Europeans of the same era, so clearly what we've been taught, that worm burden is some kind of extreme stress on our development, is clearly not the case in the sense of Vikings. I don't know about other populations of the world. I am not a world expert on populations, but I know the Vikings were much taller than Europeans of the same area. So worms were not the plague they were presented as. So here's some Viking skeletons for you. And let me show you a couple more Vikings, and this is kind of just experience in practice. This is very common. What you'll see is flaxen hair, okay, and cowlicks. Cowlicks is a little, if you're not familiar, a little kind of spiral of hair on the top of the head. And you'll see kids that are very blonde, sometimes called towheads. You'll see kids that are very blonde and light colored in childhood have a very high propensity to get these different autoimmune conditions. These three kids I know, that's me in the middle, and my brother and sister, all three with autoimmune disease. So we were definitely set up by our Viking genes for that. But that can be corrected if you restore normal structure and function. And again, the normal structure for our bodies is a worm population.